Hello and welcome to Primal Discourse. I'm your host, Dr. Hector Garcia. This show's primary mission is to help us better understand the human experience and to use science to help us develop a more humane, peaceable, rational world. To help us do this today is a remarkable scholar, evolutionary biologist, Dr. David Barash. Dr. Barash is a professor of psychology emeritus at the University of Washington. He has written, edited, or co-authored over 40 books on varied topics as human aggression, peace studies, the sexual behavior of animals and people, on Buddhism, on what it means to be human. He has taught at SUNY Oneida and rounded out his career at the University of Washington. Dr. Barash, thanks so much for coming on to talk with me today.
You're most welcome, Hector. I'm happy to be here.
So, David, given the expansive breadth of everything that you've written about, done research on, taught about, there's just a huge menu of possible things to discuss with you. But one topic that seems to hold special importance, a sense of urgency, I think, is the topic of our political psychology. But before we do that, would you mind saying a little bit more about your career? Because you are an evolutionary biologist, your PhD is in zoology, yet you spent most of your career teaching psychology. How did that cross-pollination happen for you? Which I think is great, by the way. I think anytime we can, have communication between disciplines, we come up with something very special. But how did that happen for you?
Well, I think at the risk of sounding immodest, I think it was an excellent decision on the on the part of the psychology department at the University of Washington. Not necessarily me, but the group that had been concerned with animal behavior had recognized that the traditional psychological approach to animal behavior was really quite limited. Limited to what had been called comparative psychology on the one hand, and very closely related, a Skinnerian approach, essentially rats in mazes, or occasionally a little bit with pigeons, and almost entirely in laboratories. And there was a strong feeling that we, now that I'm emeritus, I guess I could say needed a more essentially more biologically appropriate approach. And so that's what I was hired to do, essentially to teach evolutionary biology and to relate evolutionary biology to the study of animal behavior. And that's what I did for 44 years. We encourage our students to get out after 4 years, but some of us, I guess, are a little slow and we need a little more time. And I finally graduated. In the course of my employment at the University of Washington, I not only continued to work on animal behavior, but I did work on a variety of other things related to human behavior, increasingly issues about violence, as you mentioned, about sex. And then I might add that I sort of moved up my graduation immediately after what I perceived, and many others certainly do too, the disastrous 2016 election, when I decided I couldn't simply be an academic anymore and that I needed to get more into the trenches, because I felt that, and feel even more strongly now, that the presidency of Donald Trump was a disaster and one that needs to be opposed.
Yes, well, you and I share so many intellectual interests, and we share that perspective as well. 2016 through 2020 was just such a period of turmoil in our country. The fabric of American society just began to rip. We were fighting each other in the streets. Families were torn apart. To talk about Donald Trump, you risk being labeled partisan, you risk being labeled unobjective or worse. But I think when the stakes are very high, which in this case, truly having a functioning society, we have to have difficult conversations. And there's some undeniable and objective issues to contend with regarding his presidency. For one, directly as a result of his rhetoric, We had a measurable increase in violence against religious and ethnic minorities. And there was a seeming unending stream of lies that came out of his mouth, frankly. I think fact checkers summed up either lies or half truths or mistruths up to 30,000 plus over the course of his presidency. So half of the U.S. knew something was amiss. The rest of the world seemed to know something was amiss. But let me just ask you this, start out with just a very general question. Political behavior can be baffling. Can we use biology or even comparative zoology to understand human politics? And where do we even begin?
Well, I think we not only can, but we must, but with the proviso that we also recognize that whatever understanding we'll glean from biology with regard to human politics, that's not the only potential valuable source of understanding. I mean, my colleagues, our colleagues in the social sciences have a great deal of understanding, and I guess as a preface, we should agree and establish that whatever we're going to be saying about the role of biology is not necessarily to disparage the role of other considerations of history, of cultural traditions, of any number of other things. But at the same time, there is a great deal we can and I think must learn from biology. We are animals after all, whatever else we are, and we're plenty else, but we are also animals. And with that in mind, the insight I think that we can gain from biology is absolutely crucial, if only because our understanding at this point is so limited. We need all the help we can get.
Well, I agree with you. We have to avoid, oversimplistic explanations. Parsimony is great for conducting experiments, but there's often a confluence of factors influencing any kind of human behavior, including politics. And we have to avoid, naturalistic fallacies. But what seems to me is that the more irrational a human behavior, the more prone to vitriol, intense emotion, division, the older it tends to be. So I think I am drawn towards those kind of human behaviors with, explanations that come from evolutionary biology and psychology for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am too. Among those things that we have to learn, are in the course of learning, I guess, as well, are some of the consequences of our being, not just animals, but a highly social species, and one that is very susceptible to dominance hierarchies, among other things, and to group orientation, which is not quite the same as dominance hierarchy, but it certainly converges in some ways. And if we were to look at such things as the remarkable effectiveness of certain appeals that dominant leaders or would-be dominant leaders have exerted, I think we can learn a great deal from understanding the phenomenon of among other things, sort of the silverback male gorilla, for instance.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a very old and perhaps an evolutionary mismatch, but it's a very old appeal, right? Because I've made the point that there's no way a president in the modern day would ever get our back in a physical fight. Yet there are certain characteristics of our leaders that suggest our brain still thinks that.
Yeah.
Can you say something about that, where that arose? Maybe, some examples from across different primate species.
Well, I think that's a really important example, certainly even from human beings as well. It wasn't that long ago in our evolutionary history, or at least in our recorded history, when our leaders were in fact on the front lines when it came to battles. Alexander the Great was he was a short guy, I gather, but he was also pretty ferocious, as was Genghis Khan, and just a whole array. So Absolutely. It wasn't that long ago when this happened, even among humans. Now, Yeah, and if we look at other primates, we find that not that most commonly it is the dominant adult males who are essentially on the front lines when it comes to struggles with other groups, not to mention being predators, as you find in chimpanzees. And it's only fairly recently that it's been recognized that chimpanzees are not nearly as calm and peaceful as we had thought, and that they're also predators often. Um, at the same time, and again, there are many examples from non-human primates, but again, it needs to be pointed out that for everyone who is inclined to point, say, to chimpanzees or other non-human primates that are relatively violent, there are those who will point to the bonobos or the bonobos as the species that makes love, not war. And so, to be honest, I'm not convinced that we should push too hard on the notion that species X does it, whatever it may be, and hence we do too. I think, on the other hand, what we can learn and really should learn from looking at other species, and I've spent most of my career, many decades, looking at other species, is not so much extrapolating from a given species to Homo sapiens as it is looking at other species with an eye toward what general principles will they illuminate. And not all species are equally illuminating in that regard, but the basic patterns really are there, not least of which is the male propensity for aggression. There is no human society in which men are less aggressive on average than are women. And that doesn't mean there are some women who are more aggressive than some men, certainly. But that basic pattern is one that we see over and over again in other animal species, and we understand from an evolutionary perspective pretty clearly why that is. It's the old story. It's an old story now for many people, which is that men make sperm and women make eggs. That's how we define maleness and femaleness. And as a consequence of that distinction, of course, males are inclined to fight with each other, compete with each other, for primarily, ultimately, access to women, although they may not even be consciously aware of that that's what they're doing. And so we find this pattern again quite
Yes.
widely.
Yes, everything you just said. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think you're right. We are neither bonobos nor robust chimpanzees. We are our own species, but you can extrapolate the fitness strategies employed across different animal species and see them in ourselves. And you're right. A lot of our evolved psychology operates under the radar of our human consciousness, and to borrow from William James, in order to understand that, because it's so close, we have a hard time seeing it. It's almost like clinical psychology. You need the perspective of an outsider to come in and help you arrive at insights. And that's kind of the same thing, I think, many times with our evolved psychology. You need to take the perspective of an outsider. I think what looking at other species does is it helps us do that. It helps us make the natural seem strange by observing patterns in other species.
That's really, really important point. And I think many human beings are unaware of how hard it is to look at ourselves objectively. Maybe it's impossible. I don't know. One of my favorite examples here would be if you go to Warsaw in Poland, the best view in the city of Warsaw is from the top of a building called the Palace of Industry and Science, I believe it's called. Now, that's an incredibly ugly building. It's a classic example of really despicable Stalinesque architecture. Why is it the best view in Warsaw? Because it's pretty much the only place in Warsaw from which you cannot see that damn building. Okay. And so what
Right.
I think that illuminates is the issue whereby when you're looking out from yourself, you have a hard time seeing yourself. And just as when you're looking out from that building, you don't see the building. And so when we look at other animals, we have the opportunity then to see things that we might not otherwise.
Yeah. And sometimes they're disturbing truths. And I've said this before, that, in many ways, evolutionary psychology is like clinical psychology. It may not, or good psychotherapy, really. It may not always tell you what you want to see, but it will tell you what you need to see. And like you mentioned, yeah, men are responsible for probably over 90% of the world's violence, but they're also the recipients of it. So I think a very ancient role that powerful men had among humans is protecting not only against other primates but rival bands of humans, or maybe even within group competition. Pushy, aggressive males within our own groups. We have this old emotion laden draw towards powerful males, towards large males. And that seems to get expressed in our political preferences. I read this study looking at over 200 years of U.S. presidential elections, finding that the taller the candidate won in the vast majority of the times, and in every case, taller than the candidate was taller than the average U.S. citizen. That's just baffling. That says a lot about where our psychology still lies. But I think it leaves us vulnerable at the same time. What are your thoughts about that vulnerability?
Well, I think that vulnerability is very real, without a doubt. And we started off talking about our mutual disdain and distrust and disaffection with Mr. Trump. And I don't have any doubt that the appeal that he has provided for so many people is a result of his alpha male appearance. And by appearance, I don't just mean physical appearance, although that too, I gather he's fairly tall. I think he's more than 6 feet tall, and he goes out of his way to exaggerate his manliness in various ways that many of us find despicable, but others find very appealing.
Yes, he denigrates his political competition by saying they're small, little Marco Rubio, little Rocket Man, little. It's so blatant to half of the populace here, and so just natural to the other half, and that's the part that's astounding. But yes, you're right.
And even if the insults are not purely physical, the fact that they are insults is in itself an indication, or an attempt to indicate one's alpha status.
Sure.
And I think it should be emphasized, lest we simply dump on Trump, although I'd be perfectly happy to do that, that it's not a phenomenon unique to the United States. And indeed, it's one of the things that's been disturbing for many people, many observers, those who attempt to look objectively at the human political condition, that we see something very much like this outside of the United States as well. The rise of generally right-wing authoritarian demagogues who often emphasize, in fact, almost universally emphasize their alpha qualities in one way or another, and many people find that appealing. I'm thinking of people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Duterte in the Philippines, and even Vladimir Putin in Russia, even though he's actually fairly short.
But he's fairly short.
He likes to pose bare-chested and emphasize his manliness, and probably orchestrate murder of various people, which I suppose emphasizes his manliness even more.
Yeah, no, he's filmed himself working out in a boxing gym, doing the Russian martial arts Sambo. That's not on accident. And you're right, demagoguery is an old tactic, And what I find, but Trump's game was just being so incredibly concrete about it all. That's the part that I think a lot of us are struggling with around the world. Like, how could you not see through that? One thing that I found very fascinating in researching about our political psychology in writing my second book is that we vary on the natural curve in terms of how much we fear outsiders. And you know, that really speaks to the threat of outsiders being fairly prominent in our evolutionary history, enough to leave its scars on our psychology. And when you use the extent to which we fear outsiders to predict where you fall on the political spectrum, the correlation is uncanny. I mean, it falls onto how conservative or liberal you are, just almost perfectly. So, of course, those political actors, those political interests that are whispering in the ears of our candidates, they know this research. They have tons of money to throw at looking at the psych research of our political minds. And so that demagoguery has special appeal. And if there's one thing we know is that fear kind of takes over and blinds you to, the machinations of other people. It's blinding. That's where I think we can learn a lot from looking at our evolutionary biology and psychology.
Absolutely. And I think that emphasis that you just placed on fear, the recognition of fear, is very important. When other animals feel threatened, they will typically look to a powerful leader, certainly a group if possible. If they're not associated with a large group, they will be associated often with a large and seemingly dominant leader as well. And if we look at those countries in which this kind of effective demagoguery has been so successful, we find that it's almost always specifically with regard to the population or subpopulation that feels themselves particularly under threat. And so political scientists and sociologists have been looking, of course, in great detail at the appeal that Trump had demonstrated and continues to demonstrate for many. And it does seem to be very much correlated with fear, a sense of being under threat that the influence that a fairly significant group of people, particularly the white working class, if you will, and particularly men, feel that their lives are not as good as they ought to be or as they had been. Whether that's true or not, the notion of making America great again really means making themselves more secure as they think they used to be, or maybe as in fact they were. And they do feel under threat from, among other things, essentially ethnic minorities, people with other color skin, people who speak other languages, and the sense that their position is not as secure as it used to be. Under those circumstances, it doesn't surprise any evolutionary biologist, or certainly shouldn't, and nor should it surprise the political scientists, that many of these people who feel themselves under threat would be eager to adhere to a leader who promises the kind of support that the alpha male throughout much of primate history has offered.
Yeah, absolutely. And the problem is that fear, it just tends to impair higher cortical functions. I mean, we know that from the research literature. And I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in PTSD, and I can tell you every day I work with people whose fear, co-ops rational thinking. Your thinking becomes more rigid. It becomes more concrete. So I just think that is why evolutionary biology and psychology can help us achieve not only intellectual liberation but political liberation too, because most times that's the pattern of the demagogue, is to manufacture fear, and then promise a solution.
Right. And if there is some existing fear, then they can use that as a lever to generate all the more. So they not only will manufacture it if it's not there, but if there is just a hint of it, they can take advantage of that and exaggerate it and make use of it. I've admired your books, to be honest, Hector. And
thank you.
Your second one, what was it? Sex, Power, and Political Parties, or something like that, wasn't it?
Sex, Power, and Partisanship.
Partisanship. There you go. Made a really good case that's, I think, very relevant to our conversation right now, which is emphasize or to develop that well-known trope that the Democratic Party has long been kind of the mommy party, and the Republicans the daddy party, and there is some truth to that. And I guess I'm not telling you something you don't already know, but maybe the audience isn't quite as aware of that. But the need for a daddy and a daddy party is exaggerated when the individuals in question feel under threat. You look to your daddy more than your mommy. You look to your mommy to provide nourishment, sustenance. You look to your daddy, at least classically and biologically, to provide protection. And so if you feel threatened, then as so many have, they look to the Republican Party, which at least historically has really emphasized military strength, police state strength. And so it's not, again, it makes perfect sense that that's been at this point when I think the Republican Party has relatively little else to offer, it does offer that sort of hypertrophied daddiness, hypertrophied, exaggerated, and misrepresented to some extent as well, because I'd like to think that daddies are concerned with one's welfare too, and not just with fierce and sometimes even being fierce.
Yeah, daddies are also nurturers, but yeah, I get your point. I mean, it's an ancient fear. It's an ancient draw towards powerful, sometimes loud male protectors. But I think the problem is it just makes us so vulnerable to manipulation and gets us to vote in ways that are often for policies or candidates that often vote against our own interests. So how do we get the populace to understand that? That's my big question for you. And what I'm curious to know is how, first I think we have to accept that we evolved by the process of natural selection. And I live in Texas where this is an ongoing fight, I think, and you certainly have seen just I would hope a big shift in our definitely a big shift in our understanding of our evolved psychology, but greater acceptance. What was it like when you first started teaching in this area compared to now?
Well, again, I was somewhat fortunate in that my initial teaching was in New York, which is it's not as liberal as many people think, but it compared to much of Texas, it is. And then Seattle, which is more liberal yet. And so I actually experienced rather a narrow cross section. I did experience certainly. Well, I'm not sure that I experienced more opposition in the past to the teaching of evolution than I did just before I graduated. I don't think that's changed dramatically, at least in my lifetime, at least in my experience, I should say. I'd like to think that there's more acceptance now. I know there has been research on this, but I'm not familiar with the data. I'd like to go back, though, as well to the point you raised about our vulnerability.
Yes.
The consequence of our underlying biology. And again, that's not to say that we are driven by our biology, that we're controlled by it, but it's certainly there as an influence. If nothing else, I would argue, and this certainly speaks to your point about the acceptance or non-acceptance of.
Yes.
I think if nothing else, we are most vulnerable to being manipulated by demagogues, by those the poseurs who present themselves as dominant males who will defend us, etc. We're most vulnerable to that in proportion as we don't realize our vulnerability. And I think in that sense, an evolutionary insights can be extremely valuable insofar as they provide us, they should and could, and I'd like to think do provide us with some insight that says, not unlike various therapeutic insights, that says, listen, this is how I'm feeling, and now I have some sense of why I'm feeling that way, and that ideally should give me some control over that feeling. I can look at that like you might take off a sweater and look at it and say, I'm not sure I like this sweater anymore. I'd like to wear something else.
Right.
It's driving me perhaps in a direction that I don't value. And so if nothing else, that degree of insight should prevent us from being blindsided by our own inclinations. Actually, one of the early books, the second book I wrote, was titled The Whisperings Within. And it basically spoke to our evolutionary inclinations as things that whisper within us. They don't necessarily shout or issue orders, but they whisper, and a constant whisper can be very influential. But if we can look at those whispers or listen to those whispers and recognize where they're coming from, I would like to think we'll have more control. Um,
Yes, and I think you're right. I think first we have to accept the notion that we did evolve by the process of natural selection, and that's a hard pill to swallow. And something that I said in a conversation with David Buss the other day, it's like Evo science is a lot like psychotherapy in another way, and that is, it's only as good as your ability to access it. And first you have to accept those principles themselves. But I think there are some very powerful emotional reasons why people take issue with that. And something I think you covered in a book that I recently finished, Through a Glass Brightly. Did I get the title correct? Our connection to other life forms. We are connected to all other life forms very literally. We're not a unitary life form, even ourselves. But that's a hard pill for people to swallow. What do you think's behind that? Because I think we have to overcome that as well. And I think Western culture, Judeo-Christian culture in particular, I think has a hard time with that.
Oh, I don't. Yeah, I absolutely agree, and it's regrettable. In my judgment, it's one of the most hurtful myths, certainly of the West, which is that of qualitative discontinuity between human beings and other forms of life. And the reason I think that's so particularly hurtful, of course, is that it gives us permission to take advantage of other forms of life, of the natural world more generally, and feel relatively moral in doing so. And that comes very much, I think, from a religious perspective, not entirely from that, but that notion that God created the natural world, and then God created human beings, and they're very distinct. We have a soul, and they do not. Now,
yeah, and when you think about it, that's demagoguery in and of itself, because you have a big, powerful male protecting you from death itself by making you separate from other animals. You are, in fact, different. You are not, in fact, vulnerable to all the other processes of life, such as decline and death. So it's fear-based, and I hope someday we can overcome that, because the rewards are they're immense. I mean, not only is it being honest about our place within, the natural world, but with that realization, we can come to accept certain truths about ourselves and better ourselves as a species, improve the human experience. Not the least of which by acknowledging we come with the set of instincts instincts as shorthand, right? That are sometimes not helpful, that are sometimes mismatched, that sometimes we need to question. But first, we need to understand.
exactly. I have never punched anyone in the face, for instance. Okay. I'm very happy that I have never done that, and I undoubtedly never will. That doesn't mean I haven't felt inclined to do so on occasion. Actually, I can remember, as I think about it now, specifically during the Vietnam War, during some protests, and things got pretty hot, and I felt inclined to be violent, but I was also somewhat steeped in notions of nonviolence, and I'm very glad that the nonviolence prevailed. But that doesn't mean I didn't feel violent. I just didn't act upon it. And I would like to think that we can recognize our perceptions or our inclinations and decide, no, I'm not going to do that. I may want to, but I'm not going to, because there's something else going on. Namely in my prefrontal cortex, if you will, telling me I need to inhibit that. Now, I'm not a Freudian, but in my judgment, at least Freud's best book by far was Civilization and Its Discontents, where he pointed out that we're stuck in many ways, right? That we have inclinations, whether it's particularly with regard to violence and sex, but those inclinations are very hurtful and troublesome with regard to civilization, which we very much need. And the civilization is essentially based on the inhibition, the ability to inhibit some of these inclinations. And so we have a problem. Either we inhibit them, in which case we wind up with, perhaps, according to Freud at least, some neuroses, or we go along with them, in which case we are acting counter to civilization and counter to our own best interest. We may wind up incarcerated or dead. And so we're stuck in that sense. But the more we recognize our situation, I would like to think, the better prepared we are to deal with it in a creative way.
Yes. And you know, the irony is that those among us who are most fearful could probably benefit from the evolutionary science or understanding the evolutionary sciences more, right? And there's research looking at midbrain, looking at the amygdala. Like people high on the conservative end tend to have larger amygdala. They just, tend to be wired to detect and interpret threat in the environment, which may have helped us in an evolutionary past where there were predators all around us, rival tribes waiting to ambush us, waiting to conduct raids on us. But that makes us more vulnerable to the kinds of manipulations we were talking about. But it also makes us less inclined, because of religion, because of politics, to access these sciences. And this is coming from, again, living in Texas, where there is just mind-bogglingly enduring debate about whether creationism should be taught in public schools alongside evolution. So I think we need to get this knowledge to everybody worldwide. I think it's just part of how we think more critically, and not the only means to help us think critically by any stretch, but it's an important one.
Absolutely, and I think regrettably, as we were just saying, the part of the motivation, part of the resistance, is to some degree purely religious. Part of it also is a sense on the part of many of those people who find anything other than creationism very troublesome, is the notion that to recognize ourselves as part of the natural world is to somehow debase us, make us animals, animalistic, whatever. And I would love it if we could promote more effectively, and I try, and others certainly do too, and I know you do as well, try to promote an alternative view of the same phenomenon, which is to say, rather than seeing our connectedness to the animal world and the organic world more generally as somehow debasing us, to see it as an absolutely wonderful, spectacular, marvelous thing, that we are enhanced, we are enlarged by virtue of our organicity rather than diminished. I mean, if you see yourself as being connected to the rest of the natural world, how immense is that? How, I can hardly think of anything more spectacular. And yet there is the other perspective that also exists. And I'd love to see us push that, the positive aspect of our interdependence and connectedness.
Well, it certainly ties us into something larger than ourselves, which I think, among many things, religion provides that, right? A sense that we're connected to something larger than ourselves. But in this sense, understanding our place in the natural world does that only in a very realistic and accurate, scientifically accurate and falsifiable way. So I agree with you. I think it can be something very enlightening, very emotionally. It can be beautiful. I think some cultures are more or less inclined because of just cultural norms, because of their religions, to take that step. And you've written, for example, about Buddhism. How does that? How do you see a connection between Buddhism and biology? Is it more compatible, do you think, of in that sense?
Absolutely. One of my books is titled Buddhist Biology, in fact. And I think one of the key concepts in Buddhism is also a key concept in biology, namely that notion of interconnectedness. In fact, I see that as the key concept. I have to say, when it comes to my own interest in Buddhism, which is very real, I do not accept what I see as the mythologic, um, um, essentially the nonsense. I think there's a lot of Buddhist nonsense, just as in my perspective, from my perspective, there's a lot of nonsense essentially in every organized religion. And so I don't buy into the myth, the mythic part of Buddhism. On the other hand, there's much in Buddhism that speaks to interconnectedness, that speaks to impermanence, which is very closely related to that interconnectedness, because after all, when we die, our molecules go back to nature and are reestablished, maybe not quite as literally as some Buddhists believe, but reconstituted in other living forms. And in that sense, Buddhism is, to my mind, the closest, the most akin to biology of any of the large organized religions. My own experience has been that when I lecture on evolution, for instance, not uncommonly, whether in Europe or in the United States or in North America, there are people who are very much discommoded by evolution, as we were just saying. On the other hand, when I do so in Asia, the objections are significantly more muted and almost non-existent.
Interesting.
And I think that's because, again, the basic notions of connectedness are so much more themselves more connected to the lives of so many people there, even if they're not Buddhists by training. And so there certainly is that, and it's very real and very important. By contrast, you look at, I mean, the Buddha himself, who I take to be as real as Jesus was or Moses. I think they were real in one way or another, but certainly they're real in their teachings, which have been passed down. Buddha himself said, "I'm not a god. Don't worship me."
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's interesting that in many Buddhist countries, the Buddha is worshipped. There are statues of the Buddha, and people seem to have a great propensity or almost a need to worship, and to worship someone or something that is typically larger than themselves. I mean, as you yourself wrote in the Alpha God, right? This is a tendency that human beings seem to have to reify a god as the personification, if you will, of the dominant alpha male. I grew up, my family is from Quebec in Canada. And I recall at one point, actually, I was in a small private plane. We were going up to northern Quebec for a research trip, but I was stunned to look down at the various small towns, villages in Quebec. All these houses are more or less the same size, all looking quite small. And then in every village, there was a very large house. And you couldn't avoid the assumption that some really large dude was living in that house. And of course, that large house was the church. The Catholic Church was huge compared, it occupied the volume of the Catholic Church. And I'm not against the Catholic Church any more than I am against any other church, really, but well, maybe a little bit more in some cases.
I am, but
yeah,
I come from a land where the conquest just kind of scoured it, the conquista scoured its way across the, cultures and people and land and everything. But yes, and it's that's not unintentional, right? Cathedrals are huge, and you look at them and there's awe, and there's a giant altar that you kneel before and debase yourself in front of, just in accordance with that old impulse.
Major creations, major accomplishments of architecture and artistry in many ways. And yet they are intended to generate awe and subordination, certainly amongst the primates who show up there and looking for a leader, a demagogue. As I said, in La Belle Provence, the Quebec, which I'm somewhat familiar with, the volume occupied by each church, there's usually just one big church in every teeny tiny little village. That volume of that church is probably about equal to that of all the private houses put together, because it's a really big dude who lives there. And the people show
Right.
up at that house once a week and they abase themselves. And interestingly, they, most cases, I think, probably feel better as a result. Of course, there are those who feel worse because they recognize that because of their, quote, sins, close quote, they're going to wind up in eternal damnation and punishment. So at some level, they may feel pretty terrible about it. But they,
Sure.
I think, do tend to feel safer
Yeah.
because there's this big alpha dude taking care of them.
Yeah, yeah, and again, it's emotionally intuitive, but then again, there's the manipulations. I mean, the Catholic Church sold indulgences to where these bishops would have these giant manors, with serfs working on them and these lavish vineyards, all off the backs of peasants, giving whatever wealth they could muster to avoid time and hell. So before we end, what do we do? What do we do? How do we help people understand that ruse? How do we help people better understand, that magnetic pull towards large, powerful leaders, that what's called the fear then release technique, which a lot of politicians use. Create fear and then offer a solution to it. But usually the solution really benefits the person, projecting the fear in the first place. We need to do some work in that regard.
Yeah.
How do we do that? I know that's a giant question to end with, but you've been at this a long time. So how do we do that?
I have, but I was frankly, Hector, afraid you were going to ask me that because, my own bias, I guess I am just too damn cognitive, if you will. I don't mean to
Right.
pat myself on the back. I'm not implying that I'm any more intelligent by virtue of my cognition, but I think I'm just more limited with regard to my access uh, to one's emotion or to the emotions of others. I'm myself inclined to think, well, all we need to do is tell people how natural selection works. Show
Right.
them the evidence, show them the
Yeah.
fossil evidence, show them the physiological evidence, show them the embryological evidence, show them the molecular evidence. And they'll all say, yes, by gosh, yes, by Darwin, you're right. And that's what I need to do then, is to think in those terms. But the truth is, it's not just a matter of thinking, and how to get in touch with people other than by appealing to their cognitive capacities. I think to some extent this would be the job, or should be the job, of the myth makers, if you will, the artists, the poets,
Hmm.
which I'm not. I'm not any of the above. I've spent a lot of time of late dealing with a somewhat unrelated, well, it's seemingly unrelated topic, namely nuclear war and how to prevent it. And I've beaten my head against the wall talking about what I see as the failures of deterrence, the enormous dangers that are generated thereby. And some people, I think, are, if not persuaded, at least willing to listen. But I think to some extent on that score, there's a real need for the myth makers and the poets and the artists to speak to people in ways that pure cognition doesn't. You look at movies like On the Beach or Dr. Strangelove, which have been far more effective, I think, in changing people's minds than any of the textbooks that I've written about nuclear war. And I think the same thing may well apply to a large extent to evolution. But I don't know. I really, I mean, I am, you were appealing to me, and I'm appealing to anyone out there in the audience who's listening or watching. I'd love to see some artistically inclined people who have greater access to that component of our human nature to try to provide that argument, but not in the sense of an argument, provide it as a emotionally compelling statement.
That's a very interesting thought. I think you're onto something there. It can't just be cognitive. It can't just, and I open this to viewers to add whatever thoughts you have in the comment section about how do we solve this crisis of irrationality, if you will. But I do think also critical thinking is arrived at so often by chance, especially in our culture, in the United States anyway. And I do think it could be more deliberate. Do you think that's possible? Could we require critical thinking skills to be taught in primary education, for example, as a mandatory part of public education? What do you think that holds any potential?
I think it does. I think one of the problems, in fact, and I've been teaching science in one way or another for many decades, and I've long felt that one problem in the way we teach science, including myself, is that we teach it as a compendium of things we know, things we have learned. And so it often comes across to students as potentially rather tedious and rather closed-ended, rather than as a way of trying to understand the world, as a technique, a tool. And in that sense, I had long threatened to the administration at UW, University of Washington, that I was going to teach a course, instead of teaching what we know about animal behavior or about evolution or about any number of things, I was going to try to teach a course about what we don't know. This is a way of opening students' minds to the fact that science is not a statement of what we have already achieved. And it's very tempting for scientists to do that, because nature doesn't give up her secrets very readily. And so when we have answers, we're very happy about it, and we're proud, and we like to beat our chest like the silverback gorilla and let everyone know about it. But the truth is, it can be a real turnoff as well. And so your point, I think, about emphasizing critical thinking and how it's related, or certainly is absolutely essential in science. Well,
that's a great point. Not only teaching what we know, but how we know and how we can know. I think that's a great endeavor. And you spent so much of your career contributing to that endeavor in general. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for coming on. It's really been a pleasure talking to you. What's next for you before we end? What's next on the horizon? Is there going to be a 41st book?
Probably. I just finished the 5th edition of a book on peace and conflict studies, which is one of my alternative careers, where I do relate it some to evolutionary biology, but also to any number of other issues. I literally just got that off my chest. I'm thinking about doing something that would be a bit of a refreshing change of pace. I'm actually thinking of writing a book that's somewhat less serious than all of the ones I've written so far, essentially. And I'm tempted to call it Oops. That internet meme, the email meme, is you do, oops, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done this, or I shouldn't have left out the attachment or something. And a sort of an account of various blunders that human beings have made, from the Trojans accepting that supposed horse, to more serious blunders like Napoleon invading Russia. And looking at how we've made some really big mistakes and what we might try to do about them. I'm not sure if that's the way I'll go. But
I love that. We have to learn from our mistakes. I think that's kind of one of the very foundation of science, the notion of falsifiability. That how can we make improvements if we don't learn from our mistakes? So I think that's a great idea.
To laugh at them, at least when they happened in the past, and when we weren't the ones who made them.
It's easier to see that, isn't it?
Right, indeed.
Dr. Barash, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Maybe someday I'll have you back on and we can talk about war, because that's something that interests me a great deal, and I'm sure you have a lot to say. But in the meantime, I wish you the best of luck with this new Oops endeavor, and lovely talking to you, sir.
You call me Dr. Barash, I will call you Dr. Garcia. So it's been
okay, David. I appreciate you.
All right, Hector. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. You can reach me at hector-garcia.com and find my books on Amazon. And if you like what you saw and would like to see more, you can support me at patreon.com /Hector A. Garcia.